So, good morning or good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on compliance in Southeast Asia. Compliance, one of the most complex issues to handle, especially in cross-border business ventures, covering different legislative backgrounds. The obvious risks are often only the proverbial tip of the iceberg, with much more lying underneath, sometimes quite silent for a while, but with substantial financial and operational risks involved. So as precaution is much better than cure, we will provide you today with a comprehensive overview of the considerations to keep in mind and insight to monitor and to handle potential compliance issues to successfully secure your business operations. It is my sincere pleasure to not only have my most valued colleague Stefan Ewers on board as expert speaker, but also Aurélie Saada, Asia Pacific Risk Lead at Microsoft Singapore, doing fraud prevention and detection for all Microsoft clients. She falls back on more than 15 years of international experience in risk management and audit in major banking, insurance, and tech companies. She accumulated a strong knowledge in all risk areas: operational risks, cyber, product development, conduct risk, compliance, and regulatory matters. And she will kindly share her deep professional insight with us today. Thank you for dedicating your time and know-how to our session today, Aurélie. As to the schedule, we will have some presentations first and round up the session with a Q&A at the end for you to submit your personal questions. For this purpose, please kindly use the question panel of the webinar tool. And you may do so anytime throughout the session, because we will just collect all the questions coming in and refer to them later on in the Q&A session. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and made available online later on for you and your colleagues to recap anytime you wish. With all that being said, it is now my sincere pleasure to leave the stage to Aurélie. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Bettina. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for Rödl & Partner to invite me for sharing a little of bits and knowledge around this very, very wide topic, which is compliance in Southeast Asia. As Bettina was highlighting, I spent 15 years of my career in banking, insurance, in different areas of risk, from market, operational, cyber, compliance, transaction, credit, and now in fraud risk and cyber risk more specifically. I spent a few years in Paris working in France, and for the past 10 years I'm now based in Singapore and covering for my different roles more APAC dimension. That's the reason why compliance is really a topic close to my heart, but also that's a necessity of doing any business in the region. And we will see together why and the reason we need to have a specific focus compared to maybe Europe or to the US. But first of all, let's go together through the different areas we're going to talk about today. And I would like to bring you through first why compliance and risk as a general need to be seen in such a case more like a business accelerator. And I will share with you some data and we will discuss about how this is really happening in our region here. And then we're going to speak about the game. And for anybody who wants to develop a business here, anybody who wants to thrive and have a long continuity and prosperity for making business here, we need to understand these rules of the games. And this is what we're going to share with you a little. And last one, we're going to focus on some main key risks within the compliance area, which are from the region, really a focus. And we're going to go through some of the new ones, some of the recent ones, and we will see together how we can maybe anticipate them. And that's going to lead us then to the next session with Stefan, when he's going to give us more tips and concrete example on how we can deliver this. So first of all, when we speak about compliance and risk, a lot of people have first in mind that it's a burden. And we all know that we have to deal with it. We have regulatory requirement. We have a strong legislation and a strong implementation and compliance with this rule, which is happening everywhere, depending when you're located. However, what we are sometimes missing is that instead of taking this compliance regulation and requirement as burden, we need to see them as business enabler. And there was an interesting survey which was made by PwC in Asia 2 years ago, 2020, so it was only last year, beginning of last year, when they were sharing that about 47% of the company that surveyed we're really having a strong risk management and compliance framework. We're in average 10% more efficient and have a higher margin of 10% over the past 3 years of the assessment they did. And the 31% and the rest of the company who were not so much having a very strong framework and not really awareness, no risk heat map, no understanding about their risk and how to manage them, more, driving the business based on feeling or based on driving sales and products, were not performing enough. And we know that there's different components also when you calculate and when you assess, the performance of a company. But having a very strong understanding about your risk is going to help you drive your business in the most efficient way. So one idea that I like to give every time to my CEOs or to ExCo people I talk to about this vision of risk, it's like having a business is like having a car. So you need a driver, and this is going to be the CEO. You need, of course, the wheels, the motors, the tires. So that's going to be every department, of your organization. You're going to have finance, you're going to have sales, you're going to have audit or legal, every piece, of the car. But then after, you need to know where to drive, and you're going to have some stop sign. You're going to have one way, you're turning right and left. And this is really the role of the risk compliance manager, risk manager, whatever is your structure and the framework that you have. And the role is, as you can see on this slide, there is so many different types of risks that we know. And this is just like, I would say, 5% of the iceberg, the top of what we really know. In Asia, especially procurement and third party, as well as compliance for data protection, cyber, or some of the main emerging one, and some of the one where regulators and also clients are really focusing on. So just a quick reminder, and depending on the maturity of the organization, you must already have this very well implanted, or they're just giving you some thoughts. But the basic line is you need absolutely to understand which are your risks. And it cannot be just on a piece of paper or some like a quick assessment. That's really the purpose of being sure that you have this risk map, you define your risk appetite, you have a risk mapping, so that you're being sure to not go into a wall and to have your car, which can be a Ferrari, to just drive at the best and the fastest, but the safest. So really this interconnection of the risk is the top number one, know them, and aligning them also across all the businesses. One of the major mistakes that I saw, especially here in the region, is that growth is here. There is two-digit growth in most of the areas, of businesses. However, companies which are driven by sales department, by product launching, and by going fast, usually fail on the long term because they don't have this dimension really integrated. And so, Bettina, if we can go to the next slide, we can see in this very quick overview framework, that's exactly the different step on how we can really map this compliance risk and all your risk as a general. And it's really about evaluating where you are and what is your context, what is the business you're doing in, what do you plan to do, what is your strategy. And then after, of course, identified with your risk mapping or your risk assessment, where are my critical failing points? If you're a retail business and you're holding client data, you know that you will have to put 200% of control around compliance with data protection, data handling, data, let's say when you have to, I forgot the name in English, but when you have indeed to delay this data and to just stop holding them, how you inform your client, how you engage. We had recently a lot of very high important cases in Asia when people failing with this requirement in different regulation had huge fines, which was more like hundreds of thousands of USD or even like millions in some other cases. So then we analyze, we assess also the evaluation will be really about what is my appetite? How much money do we want to put in our control so that we find the balance between growing and going fast, but at the same time being sure that we don't crash and we have, a safe net which is in place. Actions will be really about working either with the regulators, working with your team internally to be sure that every step of your company embed the risk. And the mistake also that a lot of people do is thinking that compliance risk are handled by the compliance team, that the product risk are handled by the product team. That's wrong. When you create a product, you have to the point about the marketing launching, you have the concept and the design, you have targeting the clients, and you have to the point of the execution and the operational platform. At every step of every processes, humans are involved, machines are involved, and you have risk at every step of the way. And that's the reason why doing this mapping and empowering the people who are really doing the action and doing the work is critical for them to understand what they have to be aware of, what they have to think before they act sometimes. The monitoring part is something which is interesting. Most of the people think that once you have the framework, once you have your risk, once you know exactly about the regulator, then you can go. And this is where mistakes happen. As your car, you have a dashboard and you have your speed limit, you have your gas, tachometer, don't know how to say it. So you have indicators, and that's the base also for your own company. Think about your indicators. Think also where you put the threshold to be, that's getting orange, that's super red, or we are good and we can take more risks so that we can grow the business if we are all in green. That's a tricky exercise. There's a lot of tools, there's a lot of techniques. We're not going into this deeper today, but really wanted to bring this awareness in the context of this talk around compliance. Going to the next slide, we can see that, yes. So the challenge, as I was saying, we can divide them into 3 data. The first one is this huge balance. You have to find a balance between the time spent to be safe, but at the same time, you don't want to block the business. And there is no magic recipe for that. It depends of your strategy, of your appetite, of your culture, and of your vision. The more you will have a mindset and a risk culture which is approved, understood, used by every people within your organization, the quicker and the faster you will go in terms of optimizing your product, optimizing your business, and going faster. Data is really an important point, because in order for you to assess all these different compliance risk and different risk managing and covering or impacting your company, you need to have data, you need to have sources of information, you need to be sure that you can trust them. So we're going to see later on how AI can help, and there's a lot of different tools which are now more common, more affordable, well used in most of the company. But the embeddedness of tools and data-based report for managing compliance risk is extremely low in Asia. We are about 17% for the major companies. There was a survey which was done by LexisNexis 2 years ago. And so there is really a dimension of people forgetting this aspect and missing a great point of opportunity. And the last one would be communication. The idea that risk is to be done in silo, and it's a matter of reading on the MAS website, our regulator in Singapore, ACRA in Australia, doing a mapping, implementing it, and that is going to work, is really utopic. Risk is a very powerful management and strategic tool for a corporation, but it needs to be discussed. It needs to be shared. It needs to be thought and to be reflected by everybody. And that's why we always speak about risk culture. How do we do that? Same thing. There's a lot of tools. There's a lot of things to do. And especially from a compliance perspective, one of the main critical risks I was sharing earlier for compliance is this data handling. Data handling, you have to communicate a lot to make understand to every people managing your data in your organization that this is critical, for them to understand that. So moving on to the next slide, we can see about the management, and that's more like a quick overview about every type of risk, including the compliance one. How do we have to manage them? And of course, you have to explain to board and to shareholders why you want to invest in some tools. Like speaking about compliance, depending on your business, you will have to do transaction screening. Transaction screening is a huge demanding task, as most of the organization prefer to do manual. They will hire hundreds of people just to do manual screening and review. The strategic choice would be to say how much it will cost for me to buy a software or AI which is going to optimize this. That's then the strategy about how much impact I want to do on the long term, how much efficiency I want to prove. And these tools, of course, need to be fully compliant, not only of the country you're based, but the country where you want to work with, which is going to another point we will share later about cross-borders. But also, as I was saying about communication and the impact of creating a strong risk culture for every of your employees. Like, for example, something which is really common when we speak about cyber risk and data leakage, for example, all the studies which have been made on this topic for the past 5 years show that the #1 cause of data leakage are human. And you have the human errors, and you have intention data leakage. People, you know, who are getting fired, who are like feeling, you know, retaliate within the company or anything. And so I'm not saying that communicating about risk will also diminish, you know, this or lower this level of risk and data leakage made by human, but awareness is one of your best friend and best tool for limiting this compliance risk. A few times also I realized for boards that there was a misunderstanding. Boards are really want to ensure that we are compliant, full stop, but also there is some profit which are made, or there is some optimization. And speaking about cyber and data handling, in most of the organization in Singapore, we could have observed that board members were sometimes not enough educated. And so one of the thoughts that we implemented in some of our roundtable and industry-wide committee is to just educate the board and sharing them with more about the cost of failing on a compliance risk, a data leakage, a cyber risk, or things like this. So if we go to the next slide, what we can observe too is that some of the times and most of the times people will say that framework fail and it's better to go back to one centralized approach, being sure that we monitor things and not really sharing with other people within the team, or just implementing like a strong top-down in a way that this is a framework and we need to apply this, but we don't really explain why and we don't really empower people about doing why. That's true that there is no roadmap of doing a good risk management framework. There are some tools, there are some principles, there are some ideas that I was sharing earlier, but there is also some pitfalls that we need to be aware of. And too much info, I would say, will kill the info. If it's really diluted, shared without not really purpose of making people understand, or doing some very specific cases, making them practice where a failure can happen, that's not going to work. If the framework is also too complicated or too relevant, through all my years in banking, one of the major reasons why people hated risk is usually you have somebody coming with a spreadsheet with like 10,000 rows and asking you to fill it by next week to be sure that you have opened the door, check 1, open this, check 2, etc. So it's really coming to a level of granularity and bureaucracy, which is killing the spirit of managing risk in the principles. So that's one of the pitfalls observed a lot in the region, as people have a tendency to take the test from the laws, to just apply it, and that's done. And then I need to have your sign off or your tick. One of my first manager in my career was telling me that risk is like when you lock your door. So nowadays, I know that most of the time we have this automated locker and you don't even have to lock physically with a key, you know, as we were having 10, 20 years ago. But in the morning, when you lock your door, do you have a checklist telling you, oh, tick here if you have locked your door? No, you do this because this is more becoming like a habit. And that's the point about asking everybody at every level to do risk management and compliance risk by themselves, so that we don't have to create checklists of checklists of checklists, like reminder of reminders, and people will understand why they have to do that. And that's the beauty of managing risk, because then you're really so powerful that the organization will run smoothly because people understand where there can be mistakes and pitfalls happening. So another failure which was quite common, so all the point that I'm sharing, by the way, this was done by the survey, which was also done by PwC 2 years ago about risk management embeddedness, and it was across retail, e-commerce, manufacturing, shipping, and banking industry, so quite wide range. And we were analyzing why people here in Asia has also a different understanding of risk that we can see in Europe. Because same thing, even if you have a framework, you need to have the buy-in for your employees. And this is where the risk culture thoughts and all the points that I'm sharing here will kick in, because you have to make it understood by the people who are going to work locally in your organization. A sense of lack of ownership also was one of the major root causes, and like people were feeling that it was guidance, you have to do that, but same, no explanation about what. I'm not empowering you, I'm not going to thank you, I'm not going to even acknowledge that you're doing some risk protection, at your level. So really having the mindset, sharing, explaining, being sure that people understand is really key. Okay, then moving to the next slide, we can see as a summary, like to make it work. So we're speaking about tone from the top in a negative way, but the tone for the top in terms of risk culture and what we want to achieve in terms of a good compliance risk assessment, that is key. Like people at any level of organization need to understand that from the CEO to all the way down, that's a key message. Otherwise, the message will never be truth and credible. The point about the maturity test and the embeddedness and making practical, that's also one of the main gaps that people, that we observed in Asia, when the mindset is that people have a strong resilience to disasters. And that's a few years ago when I was wondering why sometimes people think risk management is not really useful. I was asking this question to a few different countries and a few different of my colleagues. Most of them were answering that, there is flooding every year. We have typhoon, we have earthquake, we have tsunami, and we are still making business. So in terms of resiliency for them, yeah, we know there is some risk, but why we will spend time to block them? Because in any case, we will manage to recover after. And that's really the mindset when in most of the organization and the people that you will hire if you want to develop the business here, you have to educate on how to twist that, meaning that we need to practice and we need to test it before this is happening so that we are not facing any interruption of service. We're not going to lose clients. We're not going to unsatisfy, our regulators, and then we are going to lead to reputational risk, which is the worst a company in fact can have. And making this maturity test or stress test or tabletop or round table, whatever you want to call it, is going to be the best example to make this listened and heard and understood. And it's basically putting people around the table and said, well, if we don't do that, or if this fail, how you're going to do that? It's kind of a business continuity test. But the point here is to make people understand, this is your role, this is the scope I'm doing, where things can go wrong, and how I can ensure that this is not going wrong. Whatever I was speaking about, launching a new product, whatever it is, launching a new software, having a new supply chain process, a new finance system, outsourcing my finance to somewhere else on other centers. All these questions need to be really brainstormed and put together by participation of all the employees in the organization. So let's move on now to the second part of the presentation, which was really about understanding the rules of the games. And playing risk in Asia is a game. And especially if moving to the next slide, we speak about legislation and we speak about regulatory. As you know, unlike Europe and US, we are living in a region where growth is going to explode. We know that. But we are facing the challenge to have a multiple path of countries, languages, culture, and regulators. So on this map, because in the definition of Southeast Asia sometimes can be a little vague, but Singapore and Hong Kong have the two stronger regulators in the region. Indonesia is really starting to pick up a lot of things. Malaysia is following very closely Singapore. So usually what Singapore is implementing, Malaysia will follow. And usually Singapore is following up Australia from ACRA. So you can see some continuity, but each of them will add their own different unique requirements. And that's getting a challenge when you have to be updated and you have to be aware about any changes, on this regulation. So that's something Stefan is going to talk to you about later on. But that's a main difficulties when you want to manage compliance risk in Southeast Asia. To be aware of the latest regulation or what is on the pipeline and how we do that. So when we were speaking about, in my introduction, I was speaking about compliance risk and the different mapping of the different risks. And the compliance risk, usually we put the data risk, data handling risk. We will put also some fraud risk. We will put also the transaction risk, meaning that you will need to be sure that all the financial transactions within your organization will be compliant with the different, sanction list, forbidden transaction with some countries, some specific requirement due to the country's specificities, everything, the cross-border requirements. And recently, what we saw over the past few years is really this focus on data. And one interesting numbers that I wanted to share with you is last year, they were making an assessment that in average, the organizational cost for data breach in Southeast Asia was 3.6 million USD. And the reason why the cost is so high is, well, this is not happening every time for sure, but the impact that it has on the organization is huge. So yes, it's always a bet about how much control, and the balance point that I was sharing earlier, how much control you want to implement to be sure that you can be compliant and there will be no breach. But at the same time, the probability that this can happen, and you still need to run your company. And there is no way that you cannot hold clients' data or supplier data or procurement data or any kind of things. And over 1 year, there was about 20,000 plus data breach, which were officially recorded because some of them have been not really publicly shared. So, another number interesting is between 2018 to 2019 in Singapore, 96% of the company base in Singapore reported having a data breach. And it could have been, you know, insider, it could have been external, it could have been for like malware or DDoS or anything, but this is really, really present. And moving on to the next slide, when I wanted to move from this legislative map, I wanted to bring you to this other compliance risk, which is impacted by cyber risk. And this is a map of all the different breach, all the different cyber attacks which is existing. And I'm not going to go through into that in details, but the main point is when you want to do business in Asia, the challenge that we are facing is 4 different root causes related to data handling and cyber risk happening and this compliance risk raising. The first one is the high digital connectivity. You must have seen all the growth number in terms of mobile commerce, e-commerce, connectivity. In Indonesia, people have in average 3 to 4 phones. The growth about mobile commerce, for example, in Taiwan and in Malaysia is more than 20%, which, sorry, not Taiwan, in Malaysia and Thailand is about more than 20%, which was anticipated. Even with the COVID, the trend didn't slow down. It just dramatically increased. The high connectivity means that you have so many different open doors for your business to be attacked about this compliance risk. So something to be aware. The low cybersecurity and compliance awareness. We know that, but we never share about this. And governments also need to make better effort to raise awareness to public. Singapore is starting to do that since last year about scams and spam, etc., but still work to do. There is also a lack of transparency as people still think, even if they are within a network, you know, of the same businesses, that this is a shame. So we have very few visibility around how we can improve on the root cause. And the third one is that, well, the cyber insurance market is also still very mature and driven to US and to Europe. And so there is not so much like tailored solution for helping people to understand better about how to monitor yourself for the cyber risk in Asia. But there is hope. We see a lot of progress on the regulator, progress, you know, in terms of the people also using and embedding this different solution. But that's a true reality in Asia. And then moving on to the next slide, which is also another risk under compliance, will be about the fraud and the fact that we have increased growth related to retail and e-commerce. So these numbers here are more like worldwide numbers, but you can see we expected by 2021 for e-commerce to reach 3.9 trillion of USD. And among the 3.9 trillion, there will be 265 billion which are lost due to fraud. And people don't really realize the impact that fraud risk have on their business. And this is one of the major gaps we noticed in Asia. As I was sharing with you, a double-digit growth, you know, for mobile and e-commerce and all this digitalization in Asia. We have a very strong embeddedness of the tool, but very, very few protection and very, very few awareness on how to protect. And one data that people also forget is that fraud will cost you money, not only because you're going to lose revenue, but because of the reputational impact and because of everything you have to fix, either there is regulators behind or by the giving, credit back to clients, the trust that you will have to gain again with banks because your payment system, for example, didn't have proper safety nets. And so in average in Asia, the cost of fraud is 3.4 times the cost of your transaction, meaning that if you lost $1 because of scam, fraud, account takeover, theft identity, it will cost you $3.45 to recover or to fix it or to pay the fine to the regulator. So that's quite the reason why I wanted to share this data with you. And so moving on to the next slide, another point that I wanted to share with you today is this framework in Asia is quite substantial. And we were speaking about this cost of fraud, but also what we forget is the impact on revenue. And in average for the company in Asia, the revenue loss purely related to fraud is about 1.75% of your revenue. So every dollar that you will gain, for your company in terms of profits, you will lose 1.75% in average. That's, overall statistic. This was based 2 years ago on the 2019 and 2019 on Southeast Asia markets, and by taking a sample of, I think it was 2,000 companies, in the different. That was really a huge review that LexisNexis performed. Business also are really not optimized for doing fraud detection and for preventing that. And that's the reason why compliance and regulators are really focusing on this area, as there is a lot of direct negative impact that client can just feel also and be victim of, sorry. So yeah, so the main problem would be this cost of fraud on your revenue, but also in terms of reputational impact and how, you will recover. The mobile commerce and the e-commerce, which is kind of booming. Everybody nowadays have to be on a digital platform. This is creating more different type of risk, and knowledge also you need to be key here. And the third is really about customer identity. And nowadays, how you identify the client for any point of the transaction on your operation is key. And you can have biometrics tool, you can have different AI-driven analytics tool, but you need to be conscious about this. Verifying the identity of your client is a challenge which is not really known and which is very difficult to assess, but that's the main root cause of why this is happening. So moving on next to the next slide, we see here, this is an overview given about the 3 different areas impacted by fraud, usually for your business. So you have at the point about purchase, of course, when client will perform, the payment operation, but you have also when the client wants to log into their account. In Southeast Asia, we had about 65% of the case of fraud were related to account takeover, spamming, and identity theft. So that's a really critical risk that companies need to be aware of. And the last one would be more about loss prevention. So we also see this trend increase, in fact, in 2020, about fraud on promotion and discount is around, all the organization for merchandise refunds and all the side process, I will say, of a company, also inventory risk and things like this. I love the topic of fraud because this is what I'm doing currently in Microsoft, and the problem that we're facing in Asia is that, as I was sharing, the embeddedness of tools and protection, which are really measured, is really low, and that's a concern that we are facing because all the industry are connected more or less together, and when there is a leak somewhere, then it's going to be really spreading around quite quickly. So that's the reason why being aware of where the leak could happen and how we fix it is critical. Bettina, can we move to the next slide, please? And that's going to the last section of the presentation from my side before I hand it off to Stephen about how we protect and secure. And one of the most, I will say, not unfriendly, but I would say unknown or misknown tool that we see nowadays is every solution based on cloud, based on AI. And as I was sharing, with you, the percentage of company and organization which are still doing manual transaction review, compliance check, client onboarding is absolutely trying to find the right word here, but there's a lot of progress we can do in Asia for sure. And very, very, very less embeddedness about how we can be efficient and having some tool. And one of the tools, we can use is I was sharing with you AI, and Microsoft is using, so this is on the next slide, Bettina, sorry. Microsoft is using for the past 4 years AI that we have developed from our side to screen all the transactions, to see, forbidden country, to see if we have some suspicions at the account creation point or the login of the clients, and everything which is optimizing us so much our operation. And over a period of 2 years, by using this AI, we saved 7.6 million for the organization. So of course, this is due to the size of our retail business. But just to tell you that by having this AI, which is the one in the box in orange, which is kind of driving and reviewing most of the transaction, we can filter 98% of the work, and then you don't have to manage a team of manual employees, who will do manually this work, and you will have more human errors, and you will have different type of issues. Which is interesting is when I was working in AIG, we were thinking to move to cloud, and as you can guess, banking and insurance business really not scared but worried about sharing your information into a cloud structure and how the cloud is accessed, security around that, where my data will be hosted, and how I can be sure nobody will access them outside myself. Now, working from the inside, I can see why organization will have some concern about using software, AI, and different tools, but I can see at the same time how this is working and how indeed we manage to optimize the usage and to protect, to be fully compliant. For example, Microsoft is working regularly with all the regulators in Asia. I'm pretty sure this is every company doing cloud software and provisions will do exactly the same thing, because government are really focusing on how the solution we developed are the most performing and the most safe for the clients and for the businesses. And so my last slide is just to share with you that, for example, this AI we were using for us for the past few years is, to the next slide, Bettina, sorry, is something that now we are proposing also to externally to other organizations. And it's kind of a plug and plug, a solution called Dynamics 365, and it's to highlight the risk to a lot of organizations who don't really think that fraud can be such a huge impact for them. Like really, 170% of your revenue to be lost just for fraud, and the fact that you will have to even take more personal costs and revenues to kind of fill the gap. It's interesting consideration to see how you can also optimize, this different risk, and especially working on data protection and how you can be sure that when you do business with clients, suppliers, third parties, this is the right person and they are conducting the right transaction and they have the right products and the right delivery. And on the next slide, that's also finally an overview about the different dimension of this, of the different steps and some of the tools. And so it's really using AI to optimize, and it's kind of a plug and play tool. That means you take the AI and you to your history transaction. So everything is anonymized. There is no reading and no hosting data, from Microsoft, or it can be Google if they will have the same tools. And it's really also working with bot, which is a generated automated software, which is analyzing transaction. The biometric protection for clients is something which is really key also for banks, because that will help to understand when the clients even log in, or the fraudster, like if it's a legit transaction or not. And the fingerprints and other different tools. And that's it. I know that one might have been a little speedy. I wanted to bring you through this journey about what does it mean to manage compliance risk within our region, and which are the different dimensions and the different approach we have to take to assess that. I know that most of you in the calls today are coming from very various businesses, so some of the points might echo more with you than other points that I've discussed. But if you have any question, don't hesitate to ask us offline, and if you want some complementary information on any of the points I've presented. Meanwhile, Stephen, I will hand it back to you.
Thanks very much, Aurélie. Thank you very much for this very interesting insight from a very practical perspective as well, focusing on AI in this case. And I think over the past few years, the AI approach has developed significantly, especially in Southeast Asia, and it was a very interesting insight. I myself, I will be focusing, during my presentation, I will be focusing more on the process-related approach of compliance management systems, and how to implement them into a globally active company, or even in a regional active sub-part of a company. So maybe we can start with the first slide, where I will introduce briefly into the corporate governance, the principles of corporate governance. Corporate governance defines the risks, the compliance approach, the controls of a company, of a globally active company, and has to align with different types of regions. Aurélie, you mentioned already that especially in Southeast Asia, we have a very large number of very different countries, very differently matured countries, and every country requires a different approach towards corporate governance, controls, compliance, etc. You mentioned also that the tone from the top is a very important topic, and that is from a process perspective also possible and important to follow. Because you see here, as the first pillar, the board advisory, the board of a company may be the board in the mother country where the headquarters are located, or where regional headquarters are located, mostly Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. So those boards will be defining the way forward, the way how to handle corporate governance in the region or globally. You can separate different parts of your risks, different parts of your compliance to different regions. You can say, for example, the cyber risk will be defined and will be handled by headquarters in another continent. And more localized compliance topics, more localized compliance issues, risks will be handled on a more regional, on a more local level. So you can separate the compliance approach between what headquarters require and what the region enforces. What the region enforces can always be a bit stronger and be a bit more defined, whereas the headquarter gives the tone, basically the approach. So the first pillar is always the tone from the top. The board, the owner, the investor will define what is our way forward. Are we 100% compliant with everything, or are we evaluating our risk appetite in the second pillar, the risk management, what Aurélie, you mentioned a number of times. The risk management is living from the definition of a risk appetite. Risk appetite means what am I happy, what am I willing to accept as a risk in order to still maintain my business in the most sufficient, in the most beneficial way for me. We have to find a balance between risk and benefit. In most cases, it is very difficult to comply 100% with all regulations, because the amount of regulations is significantly different, not only in Southeast Asia, but also on a global scale. AI can help with these kind of approaches to secure close to 100% compliance. But we have to understand what kind of impact does it have onto our business, what kind of impact will it have, and that is part of risk management, the definition of risk appetite. The risk appetite then defines the compliance. The risk appetite then defines the requirements towards the compliance management. We can say, for example, we accept risk A, but we comply 100% with risk B, and that we have a risk appetite. This can be very beneficial from a number of perspectives. From particularly regulatory compliance is a significant topic. Regulations change. Regulations are very different in between the countries, in the region and globally as well. We have matured environments like Singapore and Hong Kong. We have less, but still quite on a very high maturity level, countries like Malaysia. I would say Thailand and Indonesia is going towards that region, that area as well. On the other side, we have less developed environments, less developed regulatory environments. Take, for example, Myanmar. Take Laos and Cambodia. Vietnam is in between as well as the Philippines. So a very different approach. So regulatory compliance is one topic. But another topic for compliance management is also internal regulations, internal requirements. Internal requirements define how the company, how the group of companies work together, how are, for example, employees treated on a regular basis? We have to define an approach towards employment, towards salaries, towards benefits, etc. All this can be compliance management as well. Everyone has to be aware of the fact, the company has to be aware of the fact that equal treatment of employees beyond borders is very important, especially in Southeast Asia, where individuals talk with each other, where in compliance, where unclear, intransparent HR procedures are openly discussed very clearly. And to align this in one string is very important. So we have regulatory compliance as well as internal compliance requirements that need to be defined. Once the compliance management system has been defined and implemented and maintained, we have the fourth and fifth pillar I will just briefly touch, that is internal controls and inspector. Internal controls are the ones that make sure that pillar, those teams, those lines are the ones that make sure that the compliance management is maintained, is followed. And inspector, and we put chief accountant there because that is from a Vietnamese perspective one position as well. Inspector will then be auditing on an irregular basis, can be an internal or external auditor, inspector, auditing whether or not the compliance requirements are fulfilled on a regular basis. So this is what we call the house of governance. The house of governance, that these 5 pillars define the fulfillment of individual, corporate individual, as well as regulatory compliance with the environment that the individual country is active in. So I mentioned, and I think I would like to stress this again, I mentioned that compliance does not necessarily mean that there is a compliance regulation that will be provided by the headquarters, say, for example, the European headquarters. They define a compliance regulation, and we have to follow that in the region. Every company is different, every region is different, every regional headquarter can be different. So there is a tone from the top, they give a framework in the headquarters, and they define certain lines, certain business lines where they want to be more defining towards compliance regulations, and where they give the region, the regional headquarters, a more flexibility to define their own requirements towards the compliance management. Compliance management itself, and we come to the next slide, please. Compliance management itself is maintained through 7 pillars. It lives from an ongoing development. Compliance is never ending. Compliance management is never ending. Aurélie, you mentioned that regulations change on a regular basis. So it is an ongoing development, not only from a regulatory perspective, but particularly also from an expectation of the employees. The culture has to be implemented and lived. The cultures can change depending on teams. Every team member can be different, can have a different expectation towards the culture. And enterprises need to be trained in order to enable and maintain the system themselves. So our approach as an advisor normally is not to permanently be involved in a compliance management system. A successful compliance management system is a system that develops itself, where the individuals that are involved in a compliance management system identify issues, identify potential developments themselves. It is the communication and information pillar in the compliance management system. The integration of the compliance management is depending on the risk appetite. I mentioned this before. So the whole circle that we are going through here on the left side of the slide will be living and will be defined by the definition of risk appetite. The higher the risk appetite, the lower the compliance management requirements internal compliance management system requirements are. The higher and the more the company wants to be compliant, take less risks, be more secure. We saw what happens. Aurélie mentioned a few incidents in Vietnam and throughout the region. That's what happens when companies take too many risks. It is a significant financial burden for companies when they are running the risk and the risk actually comes true. So the circle is, we have to create a culture, a compliance culture, a training of the individuals that are involved in processes, in procedures within the company. That can be hiring, that can be sales, that can be supplies, that can be cyber security, IT in general. We have to create a culture, an awareness throughout the region. Different regions, different countries have different approaches to these kind of cultures. A intransparent procedure in terms of corruption risk can be significant in one country, I'm not mentioning any here, can be significant in one country and less significant in another country. So the culture has to be aligned throughout the region, as long as the risk appetite is aligned throughout the region. You can define a higher risk appetite in a more hands-on country. That doesn't make it compliant, but it provides you a more flexibility potential. Goals. The culture lives from goals. Goals need to be defined. What is my goal? The risk management and compliance management define together goals. I want to be 100% compliant in terms of data protection. Data protection should always be a topic that shall be compliant to its total. How do I define these goals? These goals can be defined and need to be defined on an ongoing basis by the evaluation of the current environment and the evaluation of the future potential environment as well. Risks to be defined, that is, we mentioned it a few times as well already, and the communication and information. That is, culture and communication and information are very bound to each other. Only when you communicate and inform our teams in relation to compliance requirements and in relation to the system, in relation to what we want to accept, only when we communicate this openly, we can create a culture which is aligned with our risk appetite. The organizational requirements in the compliance management, they follow basically the approach and the size of the organization that implements a CMS, a compliance management system. You can have a compliance officer, a regional compliance officer, or you can have someone who shares the compliance officer position with another position. So it should be aligned from an organizational perspective. So someone who does sales, who is in charge for sales, should certainly not be in charge for monitoring himself and controlling himself. So a certain definition of organization, a certain definition of positions is required. A program should be implemented in terms of defining in writing, defining in statutes, internal statutes about the CMS. Monitoring and improvement. Monitoring and improvement is one of the most crucial parts in the compliance management system. We cannot, and I mentioned it, we cannot stop where we are at that point of time. We cannot just implement one compliance procedure and then stop there. The world doesn't stop. The world doesn't stop where we stop. It develops. It creates new opportunities for different businesses, for different procedures. And these opportunities need to be taken care of. These opportunities need to be considered by monitoring and improvement. We saw the tool shown, presented to us just now. Even in these tools, in these AI tools, there will always be a human factor required. the human factor is very important. Only when we can define a maturity level, we can know where we want to go. And what change of law, what change of regulation, what change of cultural approach has an impact on our compliance management. Only then we can amend our compliance approach. In general, monitoring and improvement is a very complicated and difficult topic. It involves a significant human factor, especially in countries in less matured environments and less regulatory matured environments, including Laos, Cambodia, in the region, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, also in Vietnam. We don't have databases, significant databases, where a tool can automatically get information, get changes in regulations from. We don't have these kind of databases where tools can automatically develop new approaches or amend approaches towards the compliance management. There will always be the human factor that defines changes in regulations and that defines the requirement of amending a compliance management system. In countries like, I don't doubt, in countries like Singapore and in Hong Kong, also potentially in Indonesia and Europe anyway, there's databases available, and an AI tool can and will be able to efficiently create new approaches towards the compliance management systems. But in a very diverse environment, in a very diverse region like in Vietnam, it will be very difficult to have this automated, and therefore there will always be a human factor involved and required. Benefits we see on the top, on the bottom right. I mentioned before, benefits can be because we're following regulatory compliance, we're following the requirements of the laws, and therefore are not subject to financial impact, to penalties, to damages, etc. That is one benefit. It's clear that is the main benefit. And we saw, again, just by Aurélie, she presented a number of issues, a number of cases where companies, where groups, international groups are subject to financial damages because of incompliance to regulatory environments. But very important is also the benefit of having aligned an internal process. When you align internal processes, and that is compliance with internal processes, that is a compliance management as well. It's very simple. All of you do that already. All of you do a compliance management, maybe not in a process, in an automatic way, but everyone does it. I have a new employee, I enter into a probation contract. After probation, I enter into a one-year labor contract, and then into the indefinite labor contract. That is an example for a compliance management system. I am following a certain approach. All of you will do that. All of you have standard procedures, SOPs. That is part of the idea of a compliance management system. So not only regulatory compliance, that might be the highest requirement, and that might be the highest benefit, the most significant benefit, but also internal compliance, compliance with internal procedures. Make sure that everyone is treated the same. Make sure that suppliers are being chosen in the most transparent way. Get 3 quotations from 3 different suppliers. Choose not necessarily always the cheapest, but the best valued one. So those are compliance management systems. So you can go to the next slide and see how we implement a compliance management system in a small and medium-sized enterprise. It's all about the definition of a risk appetite. We define an environment. In order to evaluate the risk appetite, we need to define the environment of the company. What is the company active in? Are we supplying to our stakeholder? Are we purchasing mainly? Are we trading companies in the region? Are we sourcing and selling to our headquarters in Europe, etc. Sorry. Defining of an environment is very important. That is the first step of every implementation of compliance management. If I'm a service company, there is no sourcing compliance required, so the definition is very important. Then the evaluation of the vulnerability. The most vulnerable sections of the environment will be identified. Is it human resources? Are we a service company living basically from human capital? Is the human capital our most important asset? Or are we a production facility where we have to maintain a production process, where we have to maintain the production business? And is that the more important topic to be addressed? So the evaluation of vulnerability is important. As a third step, we would go to a quick scan. The quick scan is something where we go through a predefined approach, predefined questionnaire. Aurélie, you mentioned, sorry, the times are over where someone gets thousands of Excel rows to answer yes or no, etc. That is absolutely right. Those times are over. That can all be automatized. And more important is to create a awareness of the vulnerability, an awareness of section number of pillar number 2. So, for example, let's go through an example of a quick scan for human resources. Quick scan of human resources in the example of Vietnam, labor-related quick scan in Vietnam. A quick scan would involve a questionnaire saying, for example, are you aware? Awareness, creating awareness. Are you aware that you need internal labor rules? Are you aware that you need an internal union when you have more than 5 people? Are you aware that you cannot enter into more than into a probation contract of more than 6 years? Those are creating awareness. It's not for the sake of creating a compliance management system. It's for the sake of creating a base for compliance management, creating awareness, creating a culture, making the group aware of regulations. So questions in terms of quick scan are asked in an open way. Are you aware? Yes or no? Maybe. I don't know. I have someone who takes care of it. I have a provider who does my labor-related procedures, etc. Are you sure that the provider provides these labor-related topics? Are they part of your outsourcing contract, etc.? So those are the questions that are asked in terms of awareness, creating awareness in compliance. This can be done in all other sections as well. It can be data privacy. Are you aware of the data privacy laws of the European Union? Why would I be, I'm a headquarter in Singapore, why would I be aware of the data privacy regulations of the European Union? Do I have to be aware of it? This is awareness, creating an environment where people think, where they don't just act, where they think. Creating a habit. Aurélie mentioned a few years ago the creation of a habit, closing the door when leaving the office, closing the door when leaving the apartment. That is a habit. Creating a habit, thinking about, I am doing this, I'm doing one particular topic. Is it potentially a risk? Is it covered by the risk appetite? This creation of a habit, thinking, that is compliance management systems. Creation of a risk, definition of a risk appetite, we mentioned it a few times now. That is the 4th pillar. That is the base for the compliance management, because that defines where we go with the compliance. Analysis. The 5th pillar is the analysis. That is an in-depth analysis and review of the compliance environment. What is the status quo? Where are we standing as a company at the moment? What are we doing at the moment? Are we compliant? Maybe, maybe not sure. Potentially, there is a high risk that in many cases, because of the diversity in the region, of the countries in the region, there is a high risk in many sections that companies are not aware of the fact that they are in compliance. I assume most of the audience, most of the listeners in the audience do not intentionally comply with regulations. Of course not. Most of us want to comply with regulations, but the creation of awareness, and that creation of awareness and analysis as to whether or not someone is compliant with a certain requirement, that is the fifth pillar of the implementation of a compliance management system. Number 6 is then the development. Creation of the circle that we saw on the previous slide. The circle, the 7 pillars of a compliance management system. How do I create culture, meetings, etc.? How do I update myself with current regulations, with future potential regulations, impacts from other regions? How do I update myself? How do I update my group, my employees, my stakeholder? How do I approach suppliers, etc.? Streamlining the current items. Streamlining what we have found incompliant or doubtful in pillar number 5. That is the implementation of compliance management system. It doesn't have to be complicated. It is a benefit for the company because everyone wants to be as compliant as possible and as compliant as necessary. But considering the benefit for the company, for the group. That's the process to implement the compliance management. This is what we do in Southeast Asia, what everyone should consider in Southeast Asia as well, because it secures businesses. It secures the sustainability of the business, not only from an external perspective, again, not only external, but also from an internal perspective. You want to keep your employees. You want to make sure that everyone is treated the same. Internal compliance. That's it from my side. I think we can open the floor to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you very much, Aurélie, for sharing this comprehensive insight with us. And I'm sure there's no doubt left that compliance is one of the most critical challenges to manage, but at the same time holds huge potential to not only propel your business ahead of earlier performances and ahead of competition, but to also implement a powerful, growth-oriented, interactive and living business culture across all levels. So to everybody who feels like there are any questions left to ask, please feel free to insert them in the question panel of our webinar too, and we will be happy to answer them immediately. So there is one question referring to Vietnam, Stefan. I'd like to hand over to you. So we might have identified a fraud issue in Vietnam, and how are we supposed to handle this without getting ourselves into hot water?
That certainly depends on, well, that is not the first case in Vietnam, I have to be very honest. That quite regularly depends on the extent of fraud. Aurélie being a very professional in fraud-related procedures, maybe you can say some words later as well. But in Vietnam, from a Vietnamese perspective, it is very important to identify the level of fraud. So, say for example, a general director has performed intransparent procedures. So how do we approach this from a group perspective in order to remain compliant or to reinstate compliance? It is a very important procedure because you as a group company want to certainly reinstate compliance to the highest extent. And how do we approach it? That depends on the value of the fraud, certainly, but it is very important. It's quite likely that it's known, or not widely, but partially known in the group. It's very important to make to show everyone in the group that you're acting when something is incompliant. Action is the most important, or one of the most important topics in a compliance regulation, in a compliance management as well. When something is incompliant, acting is something very crucial. Immediate action shows anyone who is considering to act against compliance regulations that it's not worth it. So particularly in Vietnam, and this question was related to Vietnam, particularly in Vietnam, it is important to immediately act. Say, for example, there is a criminal case, a general director has performed intransparent procedures when purchasing supplies, gets a kickback, etc. Right? So the accountant might or might not be involved in these kind of fraudulent procedures, but involving someone external might be a approach to find out who is involved. So first step is who is involved. Second step, what is the damage? Third step is evaluating the steps forward. So who is involved and what is the damage is normally can be seen together. Evaluating, auditing a company on a low radar without exposing the group or the local company to this kind of audit officially yet. So making sure that it is kept in a under radar approach, and then act based on that. There's certainly a number of ways of handling this. Letting go the GD and filing for criminal cases is certainly the next step. That would be then in this little example, that would be then to be taken, and to reinstate compliance is very important, because obviously in this case there was a lack in the compliance management. There was maybe not the culture created that we mentioned so many times during this presentation. There was not the culture created. There was not an appetite communicated, and from an internal compliance perspective, there were maybe not the right people hired that follow the group compliance approach. So from a Vietnamese perspective, the practical approach is identify who it is, what is the value, define based on this the next step, basically criminal charges as well as civil charges, and then align in parallel the current compliance management system, if there is one. If there's none, implement one. That is basically the steps to be taken in these kind of cases.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Aurélie, maybe you would like to add something to this point?
Yes, I think in terms of the different steps, and the approach, that's totally right and spot on, Stefan. Like, the major things is just to understand the scope, the sources, like where your leak is coming from, why this is happening, what exactly was the process which failed, or maybe something we didn't think about. That's something which is really frustrating in fraud, because we will always be one step behind the fraudster. We know that. Our job is to try to fill the gap so that we are closest as possible at them. Something interesting, there are a lot of companies that we're working with, and they can tell us from the dark web which are the type of data or the countries or the information which are most sold on the dark web. And, we cannot hide from that. Most of us, including some of my accounts, are already on the dark web, and I know my price tag for my data is like 0.10 USD, so I have no chance they're going to be interested by taking, my password and sell me. My point is, there are so different type of people, so different way for people to perform fraud, that yes, we need to go back to what this is about. The case we see, for example, for Vietnam from our side is really about identity theft. Basic, takeover. I manage to have access to your email and to your password, and then I do transaction online with this information. Then working with the banks is really critical for us, because we can build a trust relationship when we can stop the transaction, be sure the clients will be like payback, and working, together on that. One of the fraud that also we saw a lot recently, especially from Vietnam and Thailand, I don't know why, it's on cloud. And then we had to work with the local authorities. So that's just to tell you the level of fraud, when we speak about fraud. And the person was just somebody having he was selling chicken in his shop, and so he had all the live chicken in front of his house, and at the back of his house he was selling all fraudulent Azure licenses for giving opportunity to people to do crypto mining or wrong usage of cloud platform. And so we had to work with the local authorities to really be sure that we managed to stop the leakage on this. But here we're speaking about 100,000 of millions, and we cannot do this for everybody who is performing the fraud. So it's really coming back to at your level, and if we put this into perspective, how this is impacting you, how do you detect it? You won't be able to catch the person who is behind every time, that's fine, but at least you want to be sure that your checkpoint at every entry point of your organization will be strong and will have some indicators which are going to alert you if there is a breach. Yep.
Thank you very much. I have another question in here, which is just, well, basically one word. It says a coffee money. Can anybody tell me something about this issue?
Sorry, what was that? Coffee money?
Coffee money.
Coffee money is also traditionally a big issue in many countries, I believe, in the region. Aurélie, I believe you have been exposed to these kind of issues on a very regular basis as well. Do you want to first, or shall I?
Sorry, I couldn't really hear. So you mean, yeah. So you want me to go first, Stefan, or you want to go?
You go ahead.
Yeah. So that was indeed the main issue, so more on the banking side, and Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, when you have some way and practice to do things. A lot of my friends also on the shipping industry, and shipping industry, if you want some time to do business with some other countries, you need to have your black box or your coffee money or whatever you want to call it. So that's going back to your risk culture and to your risk appetite. And what is your vision for your company? In every country, there is regulation and there is a definition of what is right and what is wrong. And depending where you implement it to do your business, you understand that there's some practice which are made, but there is also some hard stop, or there is some gray area from the regulatory and compliance things. However, it depends if you're a subsidiary of a US company and Europe company, which are really driven on clarity on process, etc. You know that there will be some hard line, then you cannot, go ahead. There are some countries when legislation may be a little more flexible to understand to which extent there will be some cap of money. Then yes, some people still use it because they're still in compliance, and that's the way in the practice which is done. I think the main point is for your own business, for what you want to achieve, what is the strategy and the culture of your company, what can you be allowed to do? And there is sometimes when you have to say no, because that's the spirit of the company. And even if you cannot make business because you have to step up and say no for some solicitation and some incentive, that's frustrating because you will see some of your competitors not doing it and going freely into this area and having maybe more businesses. But at the end, where, for example, you're going to work with some banks or you're going to work partnership or developing new products, sooner or later, sustainability and the reputation of your company will come back into the picture. And if, depending on the country when you're located, that can really come back to you like a boomerang. So I'm sorry to not really have like a clear cut answer like, yes, no, you can do it, no, you cannot do it. That really depends about the structure of your organization, what do you want to achieve, what is the overall spirit and the overall understanding of the company. I know in the shipping industry, some of the US companies understand that there is no other way to go around that. So they have more flexibility around some cap of threshold for authorizing some of this incentive to be given. Others, not at all. So, yeah.
Exactly, and I think it is also very important. Also, this topic comes down to risk appetite. Risk appetite is everything that drives compliance management. Risk appetite is very important in this relation, because are you willing to take the risk of bribery? Coffee money is nothing else than bribery. That is clear. Coffee money, the definition of coffee money is that I pay something in order to receive something in an intransparent way. We can discuss about the level of intransparency. We can discuss about the amount, etc. And is it really something that is relevant? Is it a relevant amount or not? But at the end of the day, it is always bribery. Coffee money. The common definition of coffee money is, at the end of the day, bribery. So the question is your company, for example, exposed to foreign regulations? Say, for example, you're active in the region, say in Indonesia here as an example, and your group is exposed to the UK or to the US. They have very strict compliance regulations in relation to corruption. Foreign Corruption Practicing Act, UK, US. When a company and a group entity active in US or UK is doing something intransparent in Indonesia, as an example, and that can have significant impact on the US and UK operations as well. So defining a risk appetite, are you really willing to take that risk? Maybe your operation in the US is very small and your operation in Indonesia is huge, then that has a different risk appetite than when it's vice versa. So it all comes down to risk appetite definition of it. Coffee money is, and that is a very clear statement as well, is not uncommon in countries in the region. That is, I believe most of us will agree on that. And there is certain procedures where you will not be able to achieve anything without in some countries. That's also clear. So now the question is, are you taking the risk or are you leaving this country out of the map? That's the question. And it all depends on the evaluation of the current status in that case.
Thank you very much. So far, there are no more questions coming in. This is probably because you already covered so many topics related to compliance management, which was, as for me, really captivating, and it was a great joy to listen to both of you. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much, Aurélie, for sharing your insight with us today, which was enlightening and most helpful, I think, for most of our attendees. As usual, it will be my pleasure to share the slides to today's session with everybody upon request. These slides will also contain only your contact details. So whenever somebody wants to get into direct touch with you or with Stefan, of course, there will be the possibility to do so. In addition, this session has also been recorded, and the link to the recording will be shared on our LinkedIn channel for everybody to recap or to share with colleagues upon the very personal convenience. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending and participating in today's webinar. And as always, stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.